Hey guys, I thought I'd do a short video on the installation of these V8 engines and JKs. I've been doing this in the JKs since 2008. Pulled my first body off in late 2008, and we've done hundreds of these swaps ever since. So I thought I'd give you some tips on how we do it. Now Dan over here pulled the body off this JK by himself in less than an hour. So let's take a look at what he did. Now you will notice that we don't remove the tire carriers, bumpers, front or rear. Essentially, you're going to take your body bolts out, and this is a later JK because it's not using these body bolts. The earlier ones use these. So you got a body mount here, 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 and then up here you have a stud in the body that drops through this hole. Now you can use this. And you notice that he put some penetrating oil on this. For some reason, this one here has a tendency, the bolt has a tendency to rot into the body. Now luckily it didn't on this one. Well, let's take a quick look at it. So this one's clean, but a lot of them that we get from back east, the bolt seizes and the nut breaks loose and you can't get it off. So what you end up having to do is cut an access hole to put a new nut in and repair it properly. Now he's got some extra stuff on here, some extra wires. He's got a trailer connector. I'm not really sure what this stuff is. Oh, this is part of his trailer buddy thing. Okay, so the main connector between the body and the chassis is this C300 connector. So you got to unplug that. You got to take the body bolts out. You got to disconnect your transfer case and your automatic transmission shifter cable. Now he's upgraded his transfer case cable with what appears to be the Atlas with the little Heim joint at the end, because we all know that that little button falls off if you yank on it too hard. Now this is not a really good idea here. If you look at the airflow into this radiator, you can see what's going to happen. Now the winch is sunk nicely, but these big daylighter style lights are probably going to have to be moved. So the body is now off. You have disconnected the steering shaft. You'll notice that the brake, and he's got an oversized booster in this. This looks like the JK8 booster. Stays intact. The ABS module. Now this is your hydraulic control unit, HCU. This is your ABS module, and this is your master cylinder. You notice that all stays intact. And guys, there is an O-ring on here. And I talk about it quite often, and there it is. If that O-ring falls off and you bolt it onto the master, you're going to have a vacuum leak and you might run lean. Now what Dan's doing is he's removing the engine harness at this point. This engine harness is a little bit more beefy than stock. You'll notice that the customer wrapped the whole thing, and I can tell by this marking that these heads were replaced. This probably had death tick, and the heads were probably replaced once or twice. I do believe this customer told me he was having, or Chrysler was having, some wiring issues with the harness. And that was quite common in the early JKs. They made some of these runs too short, and it would yank on the cam sensors or whatever, and then you go into limp mode. So this customer took it upon himself, as you can see, to replace a lot of these connectors and wrap this harness, and he did a really nice job. Unfortunately, most of this is going to be gone in the conversion, but it served its purpose. So we have an OR transfer case here, and you can tell because the extra size or diameter of the front of the transfer case. This is the 4:1 planetary. If this was a 2.7 241, this would not be this large in diameter. It would be down here. It'd be about the same diameter as the main adapter. You can tell this is WA580 by the connector. And this WA580 is a much better transmission than the 4-speed that Chrysler used to run. It's still not anywhere near the GM 6 speeds, 8 speeds, or 10 speeds in my opinion. You notice Dan did not open the power steering system. The pump's going to stay on the chassis along with the reservoir, and we're just going to bolt it right back up to the new engine. I'm not sure what engine this vehicle is getting. I think it's an LT. Now, as far as the exhaust goes, you can see that he hit all this with penetrating oil, which is a good idea, and this one's coming apart pretty easy. This is a Nevada Jeep, but if you got a back east Jeep and this is all rotten, when you take the exhaust out, it's just best to cut it. Strategically cut it in a couple of places and throw it away. Technically, you're not allowed to sell these converters used. Now here's a problem that the Pentastar has had for a lot of years. And guys, I'm sorry, we're just outside of Nellis here, so you can hear some of these jets flying over. This is the cylinder head. This is the catalytic converter. There is no exhaust manifold.
This converter can run thousands of degrees. We all know that when aluminum is exposed to heat, it expands. Well, inside of this head, you have guides, hardened guides that are pressed in. You have seats that the valves seat against that are pressed in. And when this aluminum head expands, it causes all sorts of issues. So what ended up happening in the early days, 11, 12, 13, was the Pentastar had something called death tick. And Chrysler has updated the head several times for this problem. And as you can tell, this engine was updated at some point. Now, I don't think this is the best design for longevity and durability, but it does seem by 14 or 15, Chrysler has got this set up to work. But I still prefer a real cast iron exhaust manifold. Now, when it comes to the fuel system, this customer has wrapped everything, so it's a little hard to show. But you'll notice these molded in holders at the front of the tank. What you're gonna wanna do is pop those out and then disconnect. There's a quick disconnect on these. This one is the purge valve. As you can see, it comes up and it goes to the purge valve that sits on your fender. You don't need any of that, ditch it all. The GM has its own purge valve. This is your fuel line, and that's gonna go up to the fuel rail. So what you wanna do is you wanna pop these out of their holders and run them up here and then along the top of the transmission, because you can see how dangerously close these are getting to the exhaust. And this just isn't an LS or a Hemi problem, this is a V6 problem. A lot of guys run full skids, and what happens if you run full skids is heat builds up in here. And without a shield, now the JLs are running a shield, and as most of you know, we offer our own shield for the fuel tank. But it can literally get so hot in here with skids that this fuel tank melts. Now, Chrysler made a little attempt, or actually I think this is the customer making an attempt to keep this cool. But you want to run a shield, and you want to pull these up. The purge line is under very little pressure. It's mostly under vacuum. The fuel line obviously is going to be under about 60, 70 PSI. So you want to make sure that's connected properly. We include a proper high pressure nylon fuel line in the kit with a quick disconnect on it. And I can't show it to you here because the customer has it wrapped. So that's pretty much it. You take these body bolts out, you disconnect the steering shaft, you disconnect the C300 connector, a couple other things, and the body is off. Now, if we take a look at the fuel tank, this is your filler pipe, and then here's the breather for the filler. So you're gonna disconnect those. This is a rubber hose with a clamp, and these are quick disconnects. This does not have the updated one-way valve. Chrysler has a problem with fuel spitback. And I'm gonna talk about this for a second because a lot of customers don't know or understand how this works. But essentially, fuel comes in here when you try to put gas into your tank, and it builds pressure up. And that differential pressure, which is sensed by this hose here. Now you'll notice that Chrysler is using a fuel tank pressure sensor in the Pentastar JKs. They did not run this on the early JKs. But a lot of guys say, well, this port's the same as this port, and it's not. This is your evap. This is where the bad gases or the hydrocarbons go from the tank into the evap canister. And there's going to be, this is a camel hump tank. So we've got a hump here and we're high over here. So they run this line to connect them so that the tank can be vented properly, then it vents through here. The purge line is actually on the canister. It's one of those. So as you put fuel in and differential pressure builds up inside of this hose, it drops a valve in here. It's called a fill valve. And what that does is it opens up the canister through this hose so that you can push fuel in quickly through here and vent it through here. If this breaks, if you break this off, don't tee it into here because it will not drop that fuel valve and you're going to be dripping fuel into your tank. So that's part one. Part two is because there was pressure built up in this tank, a lot of times the fuel would kick back and spit out the gas cap. So what Chrysler did is they made a one-way valve in here, and you can tell because it's got a hump in it, and all it really is like a rubber flapper valve that allows the fuel to go this way and not that way. So if you're having a problem with fuel spitback, I recommend you get that intermediate tube. While we're out here, let's take a look at a couple other things in the shop. This is the awesome LT4. That is an L83, and you can tell by the way it cranked up. You notice that slightly extended crank, and you can hear that compression like a diesel. So this is the awesome LT4, and we are running a 10-speed transmission in this. Now guys, just think, a couple of years ago we were running 4-speed transmissions, and a lot of Hemi guys are still running 5-speed transmissions. This is a 10-speed transmission. It's got double the amount of forward gears. This is not a standard Atlas 2. This was custom built for us by Advance. It's got heavy-duty parts in it. I don't know exactly what. I think we got some F-35s going over. The F-35s are really loud. The B-1s are really loud when they're an afterburner. And so are the F-15s. Okay, so we got a heavy-duty Atlas here that has what I believe larger pins, maybe some hardened gears, but it's designed to put up with the horsepower of this 700 horsepower LT4. Now you will notice on this LT4 we're running a low fuel pressure sensor. The LT4 has a fuel pump control module, which we have mounted over here, and that fuel pump control module controls. And you know guys, as I talk about this, I think this stuff is boring for a lot of people, but I keep getting more and more requests. We want to see more tech, we want to see more tech, rather than me just driving around after we get the vehicle done. So that's what we're going to be doing from now on. So this fuel pump control module is going to control the fuel pressure of the low side. GM can go as low as, I believe, about 40 psi and as high as 70 on the feed line. Then of course we have our high pressure fuel pump in here that can build up thousands of pounds of pressure. Here's one of the rail fuel pressure sensors. This is a low fuel pressure sensor. There's multiple sensors, and as you know, the LT4 has multiple map sensors as well as a baro sensor. So we're running atmospheric, we're running before the blower, we're running after the blower, we're running a humidity sensor, we're running a mass airflow sensor. We're also running an oil temperature sensor. We're running some GM stainless manifolds in this, and a lot of guys say, hey, is it worth going to headers? Well, that just depends. If you're going to run a shorty header, you're not going to get any performance over this manifold. This is a really nice manifold. It's running a cast flange that seals well. This vehicle got the Metal Club Game Changer on it. I think it's a pretty good suspension system. It's a good time to upgrade when you do a V8, because if you have a problem with your suspension before the swap, you're going to have a problem with your suspension after the swap. This LT4 has got more technology in it than pretty much any engine I've ever worked with over the last 40 years of engine conversions. We are running a full GM accessory drive on this LT4 off of a Camaro. Alternator, which is a one-way bearing on there to reduce friction. Our water pump's offset over here. This is our blower drive, and you'll notice it's an 8-groove. So we got an 8-groove main. We've got the 6-groove driving the water pump and the alternator, and then we have a 4-groove driving the AC compressor. Some of the truck engines have another groove on the back for a 3-groove for the vacuum pump for your power brakes. This is a full VVT engine, so we have our cam sensor, our phaser, and then back here we have a dual stage oil pressure connector. We can actually control the oil pressure. These LT engines are capable of 4-cylinder mode or active fuel management. The new ones have dynamic fuel management. I just did a video on that if you want to check it out. Now if we step over here, this is our LT test engine. We put our kit harnesses on this engine and run them, and there's a couple of different variables. This sensor back here is your fuel rail pressure sensor, and GM changed that in the wiring over the years. And if you try to run a computer designed for this sensor instead of the 4-wire sensor, you're going to have a problem. Here's our high pressure sensor. You can get a better look at it right there. This is an LS3, and guys, if you compare the technology in this LS3 to, let's say, this LT1 over here, this engine's 10.7 to 1 compression. That engine is 11.5. This engine originally ran a manual transmission, but we can run the 4-speed transmission or the 6-speed transmission with this engine. That engine, we're running the 6-speed, the 8-speed, or the 10-speed. That happens to have an 8-speed in it, but we can also run the 10-speed transmission. You can see this has our billet accessory drive air conditioning compressor bracket on it. Actually, this engine came out of a swap that we did many years ago for a customer who updated to an LT, and we're going to be putting this engine in his wife's JK because she thought her 3.6 would be enough horsepower at altitude in Colorado, but it's not. So we're going to end up reinstalling this back into his wife's Jeep. So if we take a look at the good old LT1, which you guys know is probably my favorite engine right now, it really is an awesome engine. The LT1s do have a brake booster fitting, So this is just going to go right over to the brake booster. If you have a late model JK with a brake booster pressure sensor on it, make sure you maintain that. If you have an early JK, you don't, just plug it in. The truck engines don't have, in fact, we have a truck engine right here we can look at, and you'll notice that there's no place to put the brake booster. So it has this vacuum pump, and like I say, it's run off of a 3-groove belt, and it works excellent. Now, it can get in the way of a big bore box, so you don't want to run that, but essentially, as long as this is turning, you have vacuum here. So even at 400 RPM, you have good brake modulation, good brake pressure with this setup. I really like it. You can eliminate it and plug it off if you like, but I'd recommend running it if you can. Now you will notice that this LT has a water pump on this side. Some LTs have the water pump on this side, so there's a lot of different configurations that you can work with. Here is the Gen 5 LT mass airflow sensor, and it's not just a mass airflow sensor. This has, and you can see by the number of wires in there, this has a humidity sensor, a mass airflow sensor, an intake air temp sensor. It's a multi-sensor sensor, and it does give an advantage over the Chrysler operating systems where they run speed density. They don't run a humidity sensor. They do run an intake temp sensor, but they don't run a mass airflow sensor. So they're using lookup tables, and at high altitudes and other conditions, having actual air quality ported into the computer can make better decisions for spark and fuel delivery. So this is a typical LT1 build. This is a factory variable displacement GM compressor. You'll notice that we have our machined aluminum adapter that goes to some AN fittings. We don't have the 3rd groove on this because this is an LT1, so it's not running the vacuum pump. We're running the factory AC compressor, factory water pump, factory tensioner, factory alternator, and again, these alternators are low friction, and it's amazing. Look how small this alternator is, and some of these alternators are pushing 200 amps. I remember back in the day when we were pushing 30, 40, 50 amps out of an alternator this size. And this alternator is smart charging through the GM computer. So you'll notice there's no power steering pump on this engine. We mount a power steering pump right here with our own Motec bracket.